Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Now, in association with theory of biogenesis, we'll also discuss some of the accessory theories about origin of life itself. For example, the pre-formation theory given by William Harvey, which says there is ex ovo omnia, meaning from the egg all. Thus, Jens Swammerdam and Marcellus Malpighi were the main proponents of the pre-formation theory. Now, this theory says that a preformed miniature organism, which is called as homunculus, exists within the eggs, and these believers are also called as ovist preformationists. In contrast, some of the other of them believe that preformed miniature organism or homunculus exists within the sperms. They are called as spermis or animalcules. As you can see in this drawing by Nicholas Hartsocker in 1695, a tiny person is there inside the sperm. Now, these two contrasting schools of preformationists have also been propagated by Charles Bonnet, who was mainly an ovist preformationist, who gave the theory of encasement or emboitment. According to this theory, the initial members of a species had within it the preformed germs of all future generations. Eve's ovaries had entire preformed human species nested like an infinite set of Russian dolls. Just like these Russian dolls, this has this, has this, has this, has this, and so on. So Eve had all the preformed human species nested like these in her ovaries. This is called as encasement or emboitment theory, which was mainly given by the Bonnet. Also, there is a theory of epigenesis in contrast to preformationist or the encasement theory. The theory of epigenesis given by Caspar Friedrich Wolff is also called as new formationist. It says that embryo develops by the gradual differentiation of the undifferentiated simple tissue into the organs. So it is against the preformist theory. Then we come to theory of biochemical origin of life, which is also called as modern hypothesis of origin of life, which is based on the theories given by A. Operin and J.B.S. Haldane. This theory says that organic molecules could be formed from abiogenic materials in the presence of an external energy source. Now, this external energy source in the primitive earth could be an ultraviolet radiation, cosmic radiations, volcanic energy, and so on. And it could occur in the primitive atmosphere, which was reducing in nature, in the presence of ammonia, water vapor, and other gases. Now, this theory of biochemical origin has been supported by experiments by Stanley Miller and Harold Urey, which commonly called as Miller-Urey experiments. In this experiment, if you see, they took water here and they heated it. So it resembled just like primitive ocean. The water vapors traveled through this path, and here they faced this electric spark, which resembled just like lightning or the energy source in the primitive earth, in the presence of the primitive gases like ammonia, methane, and the water. When it condensed to various molecules, and these samples have been collected from here, the sampling probe, and these samples contained the organic molecules like amino acids, which showed that if you resemble the primitive atmosphere of Earth, you can collect the organic molecules originating from the simple molecules under these primitive conditions. In brief, if you see the biochemical origin of life or modern hypothesis of origin of life, the main postulates are: the universe originated around 13.7 billion years ago by the Big Bang theory. The solar system originated at around 4.6 billion years ago by the nebular hypothesis. And then the Earth is around 4.56 billion years old. Then the molecules of life originated, the simple organic compounds, and the process is called as chemogeny or chemical origin of life. Then from these simple molecules, complex organic compounds or the macromolecules are formed, just like proteinoids. Then the origin of protocells or something called as organized structures, just like in the form of operins, coacervates, or the Fox's microspheres, the nucleic acids, nucleoproteins, protobionts, etc. are formed. From there, the primary living organism were formed, and this process is called as biogeny or the biological origin of life. From there, the complex organisms, just like eukaryotes, could be formed from these prokaryotes with the evolution of mode of nutrition. The endosymbiotic theory favors that, and so on. We will take all these biochemical theory postulates when we'll discuss in the next lecture about the origin of life. Again, in connection, we'll have to discuss some accessory theories. Prominent of them is theory of catastrophism given by George Cuvier, the founding father of paleontology. He observed sharp discontinuities in the fossil records and believed in fixity of species. So he said that catastrophic event, the sudden catastrophic event, are responsible for Earth's feature which we see now. In contrast, there is something which we call as theory of uniformatarianism or the theory of gradualism given by James Hutton and popularized by Charles Lyell. In contrast to catastrophism, this theory says that most of the features on the surface of Earth were formed by gradual or slow ongoing geological processes and not by the sudden catastrophic events as proposed by theory of catastrophism. There is also something called as theory of orthogenesis. It's also called as progressive or orthogenetic evolution, which was given by Wilhelm Haake and popularized by Theodor Immer. Now this theory says that evolution of a species is a continuous, non-branching process, and this is due to a predetermined series of alteration intrinsic to the species and not subject to selection and adaptation. That means every species have some intrinsic pathways which are being followed for its evolution in a unidirectional or linear path. Then we come to a very prominent theory of evolution of life, which is called as Lamarckism or popularly called as theory of inheritance of acquired characters, which was given by Jean-Baptiste Pierre-Antoine de Monet Chevalier de Lamarck, which is a very long name and very commonly called as Lamarck. According to Lamarck's theory, the new needs to survive in a particular environment and the use and disuse of a particular organ, individuals acquire new characteristics which are inherited by their progenies, and that is why this theory is called as theory of inheritance of acquired characters. Means the characters which an individual acquires during its lifetime because of either the need of it or because of more use or no use of a particular organ, they are being acquired and inherited by the successive generation. So this theory is called as Lamarckism, and you must be very familiar about this giraffe story given by Lamarck. According to this theory, the proposed ancestor of giraffe were not having the long neck. They were just like modern day okapi. They used to stretch their neck so that they could approach the leaves on the higher trees. So they lengthened their neck to reach the leaves so that they can feed. So the environment, the local environment, forced them. This was the need, because of which they developed this organ, the long neck. And then this characteristic which they acquired during their lifetime, they passed it to the next generation through reproduction. And that is why the modern giraffes do have a long neck, because the new needs or the environment forced them to have a long neck, which was inherited to the next generation. But they were very strong disprovement or discardment for this theory of Lamarck. One of the person who actually discarded this theory is called as August Weismann, who discarded it on the basis of various experiments. And his famous experiment was when he cut the tails of mice for almost 32 generations. And even after 32 generations, he couldn't observe any tailless mice. So that's what he said, that inheritance of acquired characters is not possible. If it is so, the next generation after cutting 32 generation tail of mice should be tailless. This theory is called as theory of continuity of germplasm. According to this theory, germplasm, the essential element of germ cells, which is independent from all other cells of the body, that is somatoplasm, is the hereditary material that is being passed from generation to generation. So the characteristics which are restricted to somatoplasm or the somatic cells, they are not being inherited. It is only the genetic material or the germplasm related characteristics which are being inherited to the next generation. Then came the theory of Neo-Lamarckism, which was an improved theory or refined theory of Lamarck, which has been supported by a number of biologists. According to this theory, the acquired characters in one's lifetime, which have been incorporated in the germplasm of an individual, are inheritable. So they rectified the problems which were there in the Lamarckism theory. These characteristics accumulate generation after generation and thus leading to new forms or so-called the new species. The Neo-Lamarckists proved their point using various experiments, and they said that environment can influence germ cells directly as well as through somatic cells. So they carried out a number of experiments to prove their point. Also, the acquired characters or the somatic variations can be carried to the offspring by germ cells. So, as I said, it was an improved version of Lamarckism. Then you all must be very familiar about theory of natural selection given by Charles Darwin, which is also called as Darwinism. According to this theory, there is a geometric increase in the number of individuals of a particular species. So that means there is a reproductive ability, but the resources which they require are limited. So there is a restriction put on them through environment. And under these two circumstances, it is obvious that the individuals will undergo struggle for existence. And in order to survive, they'll have to undergo through number of competitions. Now these competitions can be either intraspecific, that means within the members of the same species, interspecific, or with the environment. Along with the heritable variations, that means the differences in the genetic traits, they lead to the survival of fittest, which we commonly call as natural selection. So nature selects the individual which is the most fitting to survive across these environmental conditions. Then further, the environmental changes or adaptations take place, and this is how the evolution comes into play. So this flow chart, which is given by Darwin, has also been given by the Charles Wallace. Now the same story of giraffe, if you see through Darwinism, it says that giraffe, when reproduced, some of them some of the individuals were born with longer neck. So that means a variation was already there. Now the ones which were having long neck, they could reach the leaves of higher trees and thus they could survive. So this is the survival of fittest. And then when they grew older and reproduced, the ones with long giraffe, this trait was inherited across the generation, and this is how the evolution took place. So going back to Darwin's postulates, there is a competition here because the resources are limited and there are a large number of species, large number of organisms. So because of competitions, those which were fit or the fittest, they could survive and reproduce to propagate their species. But how these variations come into play, which we discussed in case of Darwinism. For that, there is something called mutation theory given by Hugo de Vries, which says new species are not formed by continuous variations, but by sudden appearance of variations, which he named as mutations. Mutations cause variations, which is the raw material for evolution. As we just discussed, the variety was already existing in nature, and only the nature selected the ones which were suitable enough to survive those conditions. These variations were caused by mutations, and these variations are the raw material for evolution. But these mutations are sudden and inheritable. Just like Neo-Lamarckism tried to improve the theory of Lamarck or Lamarckism, there is something called Neo-Darwinism also, which tries to improve or rectify the lacunae in the Darwin's theory. Discovery of mutations and development of Mendelian genetics led to notion of large-scale evolution by jumps or saltations rather than by the gradual changes as proposed by Darwin. So if you see, Neo-Darwinism is simply reconciliation of Mendelism or the genetics and the population genetics with Darwinism, forming something called Neo-Darwinism. If you see the postulates of Neo-Darwinism, it became widely accepted through genetics by 1930s that evolution is a phenomena at population level, not at the individual level. It can be represented by changes in gene or allele frequencies due to natural forces, and these changes may lead to differences among populations or species, etc. So this Neo-Darwinism was nothing but a population genetics view of evolution. The term population genetics or the founding theorem for population genetics was given by G.H. Hardy and W. Weinberg. There is also something called modern synthesis of evolution, which is also called as synthetic theory or evolutionary synthesis. In the 1940s, systematics and paleontology were added to population genetics view of evolution, which we now call it as modern synthesis of evolution. So, with Darwinism, when population genetics and Mendelism came into play, it was called as Neo-Darwinism. And along with that, when systematics and paleontology came into play, we call it as modern synthesis of evolution. According to this theory, it's simply the reconciliation of Darwin's theory with the finding of modern genetics, which includes Mendelism and population genetics, which gives rise to a theory that emphasizes the coaction of random mutation leading to variations, selection, genetic drift, and the gene flow. Now, this modern synthesis theory says that evolution is a hierarchical process that operates at 3 different levels. Now, these levels can be genetic level, means changes in genetic composition of individuals. That means at the individual level itself, but again below that at the molecular level or the genetic level. Beyond that, if you go, it is the organismic level, which comprises of individual variation and the differential survival through adaptation and evolution of new structures, behaviors or functions. comprising of these individuals. There is next level of evolutionary hierarchy, which is called as population level, which comprises of changes in gene flow between populations and subsequent origin, radiation and adaptation of species. So, according to modern synthetic theory, these three levels of evolution do operate because of various phenomena which we just discussed, including population genetics, Mendelism, selection, etc. Then there is something called neutral theory of evolution, which is again in contrast to what we just saw in case of natural selection. This was given by Muto Kaimura in 1968. This says the random genetic drift rather than the natural selection is the main cause of evolutionary processes at the molecular level. It believes in non-Darwinian evolution, means it is against the Darwinian mode of evolution. It says that most genetic variations is due to the accumulation of neutral mutations. So mutations are occurring, but these are neutral mutations that have attained high frequencies due to the genetic drift. And it does not preferentially select for any particular allele. These neutral mutations do not affect the phenotype, so they are not acted upon by natural selection. So now you can see there are two school of thoughts. One is called as neutralist and another one is called as selectionist. Neutralist believes that most genetic variations arises from neutral genetic mutations and genetic drift. In contrast, selectionists believe that beneficial mutations and natural selection are primarily responsible for evolution to occur. Though both have contrasting views, but both of them believe that genetic drift and natural selection play key roles in evolution. Now, having all the theories briefly discussed, let's have a quick summary of what we covered in today's lecture. We started our discussion with evolution, or more specifically what is biological evolution or the organic evolution, where we saw various definitions of evolution and the consensus of what should be termed as evolution. Then we discussed various theories related to origin of life. So besides the Greek theory, ancient Greek theories which we discussed, we focused on theory of spatial creation by Father Soares, then theory of pangenesis and the various proposed mechanism of pangenesis. We discussed the abiogenesis or existence of life from non-living material, theory of biogenesis, then the biochemical origin of life, where we discussed the Miller-Urey experimental proof also for this biochemical origin of life. We also discussed in brief the contrasting view of evolution and creationism. After that, we moved to other theories which are accessory in nature but related to evolutionary concept, including the preformation theory, the encasement or emboitment theory by Charles Bonnet, epigenesis theory, theory of orthogenesis, catastrophism theory and the theory of uniformatarianism. And lastly, we came to discuss various theories related to evolution, where we first discussed the theory given by Lamarck called as inheritance of acquired characters, theory of continuity of germplasm by August Weismann. Then we discussed the Neo-Lamarckism, theory of natural selection by Charles Darwin, the Neo-Darwinism view, mutation theory, modern synthesis theory, and lastly we discussed about neutral theory of evolution. Now for further readings, I would like to suggest you these books which you can refer for all these points in details or additional information. These books are by Ridley, another one by Holland Hallgrimsson, and another one by Douglas Futuyama. Thank you and happy learning.